Yeah, sounds good. And thanks again for having me. It's really lovely to be speaking with all of you. Some of you I already know, which is pretty cool that you popped in today. And I just want to say also, I think it was Fabian and who was it? Carl, was it you who mentioned future cities? And Fabian, you mentioned VR interest? I gotta say, I'm so fantastically interested in both of those things because at the Society Library, we're extremely interested in researching different ways in which we can visualize knowledge. And I always can't help but go to like the VR space and think about like how we can make interaction much more multidimensional and even like physical and kinetic. So I'm so excited about that, even though we're not working in that space. I want to get into that space. And then also when it comes to future cities, the Society Library has also been recently working on creating decision-making models for city councils. So I'm going to talk about our work in general and talk about all these different projects that we're involved in. And if it's not too gauche, I also have visual aids and I can flip between screens to show you what I'm actually talking about, if that's all good with you.
Wait, hang on. You said if it's not too gauche, you have something, and I couldn't hear the words.
Like I have visual guides. So I have like presentations and tabs open so I can show people things.
Yeah, excellent. Absolutely.
Okay, great. So I think I'm looking for this. Okay. So in case any of you don't know who we are the Society Library. We're a nonprofit collective intelligence nonprofit. I'm going to start this presentation just by talking about who we are and what we do. And then I'm actually going to show you what we're up to. And I'd love to source some of your feedback and some of your ideas because some of you have been thinking about these types of projects for decades. And I'm only 3 years in, have been thinking about it for about, 7 to 10, but I'm only 3 years in terms of like implementing these things. So I'd love to get feedback and to hear how you think we could grow and expand what we do. So we're the Society Library. Skipping ahead a little bit, the main projects that we're working on is essentially like, how can we model societal scale deliberation? How can, in modeling societal scale deliberation, we can actually start creating ways in order to have more informed, inclusive, and unbiased decision-making? How can we generate policy more collaboratively by taking in the inputs of individuals? And then ultimately, how can we have a common knowledge library on complex social and political issues that can inform the general public? So all of these are very like pro-social, pro-democratic projects. The Society Library itself is kind of attempting to fill a role in society. In the United States, we have something called the Congressional Revenue Service. It's run by the Library of Congress. In the US, the Library of Congress actually prepares all of these lovely briefs and does all of this research for our members of Congress, our senators, and our House representatives. However, if I'm not mistaken, at the state and local level, as well as for the general public, these types of research services don't exist. So our Congress people, they can make a request to be brought up to speed on the topic of AGI, and an entire library will work to organize and do all this research to deliver them knowledge products. And the Society Library is looking to do that for the general public and also at the local and state level in government. So some of these projects that we work on are deliberation mapping projects, like our Great American Debate program, which I'll talk about specifically. We want to get into a project which we'll probably rename because everyone hates it. I called it the internet government. People assume we mean governing the internet. We certainly do not mean that. It just means enabling governance platforms on the internet. So how can we generate policy? How can we produce decision-making models that are informed from the collective input and deliberation of essentially what we're aiming for is an entire nation. So we're really working at the societal scale, and I'll talk about how we do that. And then ultimately in our timeline, we want to fill this role as being a cumulative common knowledge resource for the public. And so I'm going to talk about where we're at right now, which is modeling societal scale deliberations. And I'm going to get into how we actually go about accomplishing that. Currently, the topics that we've worked on, that we've cut our teeth on in the past few years have been the topic of nuclear energy, climate change, COVID-19, and election integrity issues. We've mapped a few other spaces as well, like essentially associating actors with actions in political movements. So for example, we were mapping these kinds of things out in the George Floyd protests. What we're really interested in is finding what are the fundamental questions that society has about specific issues. Currently, we're working within English-speaking United States. And then can we go ahead and deconstruct the collective knowledge content that we have to go about compiling answers to those questions so that we can compare and contrast what propositions, what positions, what arguments have more or less evidence, what kind of evidence, how much evidence produced at what time in corroboration with what. So we're really interested in just being able to start visualizing the complexity of our social and political discourse so that, again, it can down that timeline, start informing decision-making models in the production of policy. So if it's not obvious, to me, what we discovered when we undertook the project of, okay, well, let's start mapping these debates, is that debates in the United States on these high impact, persistent, polarizing issues are actually unbelievably large. So the topic of climate change, I think we're now up to 278 unique subtopics of debate, and there can be tens of thousands of arguments and pieces of evidence in each one of those subtopics. But interestingly, what we found is that all of these subtopics correspond to answering only one of 6 questions. So all of these debates that are happening across various subjects related to conceptualizing the problem of climate change and its severity, to solutions and things like that, all of them are really responding to 6 fundamental questions. Our latest subject that we're working on is nuclear energy, and we're still assessing what those fundamental questions are for COVID-19, because it was such a new subject, and I think it was so global and so viral. We found over 500 and basically 13 fundamental questions. And for election integrity, there was 81 subtopics and 2 questions. Today, I'm also going to be showing you a project that we're going to be releasing at the end of this month, which I'm really excited. So I'll actually take you through the data structure and tell you more of what all of this actually means. I'll show you questions, I'll show you subtopics, etc. So how do we go about like creating these debate maps, which again, I will show you what they actually look like towards the end. We have this process that we've developed. Essentially, it starts with archiving and collecting mass content, transcribing it and standardizing it to text, extracting arguments, claims, and evidence, and categorizing those, clustering those into hierarchical categories, and then inputting that structured content into a database, and then tinkering with visualization so that essentially we can compress as much knowledge as possible in visualizations that can convey the complexity without being way too overwhelming. So something that's what we're really interested in is, how do we create knowledge compression where people can see as much knowledge as they want to see, and they have the flexibility to work in various dimensions to unpack what they want to explore as they want to explore it. So instead of an author who's writing a book or a paper taking a reader through a specific narration, instead it's about how can we visualize all the possible narrations that a reader can go through, and they can unpack in the direction that they want to. And I think we've had a recent breakthrough in how we're going to go about doing that in a really simple way. So I'm really excited about that. I'll show you a tiny little sneak peek of it. But most of it's under wraps until we launch the project at the end of this month, if all goes according to plan. So that's the basic process, but let's get specific because that kind of matters. So when we talk about archiving, what do we mean? First, we built a bunch of custom search engines to essentially make sure that we're pulling from all across the political spectrum and across different forms of media. We also have curated feeds that we keep an eye on. We also are aware that it's really important to break the digital divide. There are just some things that people are not going to be willing to write a Medium post about or post on Twitter, but are ideas that they have that they do want to express. So facilitating conversations and recording those interviews with permission in order to gather that audio data is very important. We've also acquired access to various searchable databases. GDELT and the Internet Archive have just been absolutely wonderful to us. Sorry, the screens are kind of in my way at this point.
By the way, Jamie, we are in no hurry.
Okay. Well, I just talk fast. It's kind of the way I do.
No, your talking is fine. It's just when you seemed a bit stressed about the screens and stuff, we're just having fun, and this is amazing to listen to.
Okay, cool. Thank you. All right, so now that the screen is in my view again, one thing I do want to emphasize is that the Society Library takes very seriously our research methods. We have over 22 methods that we developed to try and counteract our own research biases, our own echo chambers. We have a list of policies also on our website that talk about all the wicked problems of knowledge management that we're seeing. So like when it comes to like inputting content in the database, are we going to platform a dog whistle that we're aware is a dog whistle? Are there going to be policies about like trying to referee if one group is calling another group's language a dog whistle when perhaps it isn't? Like there's all these wicked issues that we care very much about, in addition to the methods that we've already deployed in order to overcome our own biases. And we've got a virtues and value page related to how we see ourselves in relation to knowledge. So when it comes to like us digging and scurrying around and archiving all this content, how do we feel about misinforming and disinforming content and things like that? We like to approach our work with like total intellectual humility, and those virtues and values are listed on our website. And so we talk about that often in the culture of the library. We often hire librarians who have their own code of ethics that we also appreciate very much. The librarians in general in the United States take a very anti-censorship stance and instead argue that if there's the right content context, any information can be interacted with to enable enlightenment. So it's not that some information should be hidden away, but what is the right context for knowledge to be experienced so that it informs and enlightens rather than like corrupts and persuades. So we have developed our own code of ethics. We also are members of the ALA, so we adhere to those rules as well. So I just love to say that. And then the process also begins by like this kind of flyover, we call it, where we quickly find a whole mass of topics. This can be done manually or computationally, where we just collect a bunch of topics across various media types. And we do that by specifically targeting and grabbing sample collection across different media types that contain certain keywords that are related to certain topics. So, if we're mapping something related to nuclear energy and tritium leaking into the environment, which is a radiological hazard, is one of those topics, our archivists and librarians are going to go through and find where does that keyword happen in podcasts and books and definitions and government documents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not only through time, but also from news articles that are across the political spectrum. So once we have that diverse set, that's when we do the next step. Oh, and let me just quickly say, where we collect content from: scholarly articles and research papers, online news, websites and blogs, social media, Twitter, recently TikTok, Facebook and Reddit. We pull from documentaries, videos and television, topic-specific community forums and groups, conference videos and summaries, government publications and websites, existing FAQs and online resources. And then we also conduct interviews with industry leaders, thought leaders, and experts. And pro tip, so many government agencies in the United States actually have in-house librarians, and they are so helpful. We just send them our research questions saying, hey, can you look through your entire agency's library and help us find the relevant documentation? And oftentimes they're more than willing to help. So that's just really lovely. So anyway, once we grab these sample sets of data, we deconstruct all of that into text. So we transcribe it, we translate it, we parse it. Sometimes we even hire people to actually type up descriptions, text-based descriptions of videos and graphic imagery. So we have that text, so it's searchable. And then once we have that content, what we do is we start deconstructing the arguments, claims, and evidence. So we've got a training program for that. We have our own standards for what we mean by claim, derived claim, implied claim, implicit claim, argument, etc. And I'm going to show you kind of what deconstruction looks like, because just because it's good to know what we're talking about. So this is a transcript from a Sean Hannity clip. It's an old example, but it's one of my favorite examples because one of our favorite people at the Internet Archive asked us specifically to deconstruct this because they couldn't believe that Sean Hannity would make all these claims. I think this is only about like 17 minutes in length. Yeah, it's about 16 minutes and 20 seconds. And all the claims that we were able to extract, I think, let's see here. 100, the implied ones are hidden away. So in terms of directly derivable claims, Sean Hannity made 179 claims in his 17-minute snippet. And there was way more implied. I accidentally pulled up the wrong example. So sorry about that. I'm not an Excel spreadsheet whiz, so I don't know how to unlock the hidden implied claims. But anyway, from the exact transcript, which is right here, we actually pull out the arguments and claims directly. So oftentimes you can see that there's one line right here that can actually pull various claims from that. And that's because language is complex, it's dense, and we really want to extricate all of those tiny little fundamental units of reason, because we actually want to fact check it, qualify it, debunk it, steelman it, devil's advocacy it, all these things. Another example I'd like to show, this is the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal was famous in legislation in the United States. When we're training our students, because we have various educational internships, we've worked with 32 universities in the United States. One of the training projects the students do is they deconstruct the Green New Deal to kind of get a handle on what the Society Library Standard for Claim is. So I think there's like 438 claims in the Green New Deal, and it's a very short piece of legislation. Like if you just copy paste it to a Google Doc, it's like 13 pages, I think, and relatively big font. So it's like relatively short documentation, yet there's 438 claims, and there's very little evidence that's usually provided in legislation. It usually qualifies itself within like it actually does have an interesting structure. It's very complex argumentation. It has a premise where it says, Congress finds, given this document, which they reference the IPCC report, if I'm not mistaken, these are our findings and our conclusion, which is the recommendations by Congress to create a specific like policy program or whatever. So yeah, we deconstruct pretty far, I would say. And then going back to the presentation, what happens when we have all of these claims? that's when we start categorizing them. So these claims are going to have keywords. Those keywords are going to be semantically related to other keywords. There's ways in which I hope in the future we're going to be better at computationally clustering these things together. I'm really interested not only in taking the data that we've created, using it as training data for claim mining, but I'd also like to start seeing if we can generate syllogisms just by the relationship between the keywords in text snippets, so that potentially with enough training, maybe our analysts would have more of a fact-checking role than a constructing arguments from base claims role. But currently what we do is we categorize and cluster claims based on their relatedness to specific topics. So they may be, for example, on the topic of nuclear energy. It could have to do with grid reliability or stability, the tritium leakage, other radiological issues. We just cluster those into categories. And then from those categories, we're able to derive different positions and more complex argumentative structures. I'm going to show you what some of that looks like in the debate map as we go on. And then I will say also that like we've been very fortunate to have a very large tech company who we're not allowed to name and a lovely university who we're not allowed to name, who've made fantastic argument mining technologies, and they've given it to us to use, but they're, you know, we're a small nonprofit. So they're like, yeah, don't tell anyone we've done this. So we also have interesting argument mining tools, and we're hoping that the training data we're creating can make things that are even better. And this is just an example again, like, so this in this one natural language text snippet, we can pull all these claims. A derivable claim means that we can essentially use the same language in the text snippet and just cut out some things and reconstitute it in order to create a claim. When an implied claim is that like, you have to have some sort of insight into the meaning of the claim itself, which requires human intelligence in order to suggest that this claim would have to be a part of the argument or one of the premises of the argument in order for the claim to be, you know, proven to a certain extent or made sound or valid. So our analysts are also trained to put in implied claims, but also mark them so they don't get confused with things that have been derived from evidence or from sources. So that's just an example of that. And then understanding our hierarchy is really important too. What we found is that if we just randomly choose a question or randomly choose some dimension of a debate, what happens is as we're hand mapping the logical argumentation from that one point in the debate, we start to quickly get into spaghettification problem. So we start like having arguments that are somewhat relevant and just kind of spiders out and curls in on itself. It's very messy from what I'm told from people who've worked in AI for a long time. It's called a good old-fashioned AI problem. But what we've discovered is if we just do this kind of like hierarchical clustering, over time, that's essentially what we can do is have this descriptive emergent ontology that occurs. And what's interesting is that the questions that are derived from finding the references and evidence, extracting arguments and claims, organizing those into those categories, and then identifying those positions is in finding those questions, the questions in turn give, shape the relevance of what can be modeled in response to the question. So if we're interested in like having the most steel-manned formal deliberation possible, it's the responsibility of our analysts to make sure that the positions are actually answering the question. So in finding the questions that give shape to the relevance of the argumentation, which has kind of really helped us avoid that whole spaghettification problem. I don't know if it solves that good old-fashioned AI problem in general, but it's just something that's really helped us. We call it descriptive emergent structuring, and we've used it on all of our debates since we learned the first few like tests that just picking a random part of a debate isn't going to work for us. And then we go ahead and map this content. So we have a debate mapping tool. It gets better every single week. We ship new features and make it even better. Some of the things that we can put into this debate mapping tool includes, question nodes, category nodes, argument nodes. We can create multi-premise arguments, like unbelievably rigorous logical proofs. There's claim nodes. We can also, within every single node, have definitions, variant phrases, videos, images, media, equations, references, and quotes. There's ways in order for people to participate in calculating impact and veracity scores. And then every single claim and node can have a pro, con, truth, relevance argumentation associated with that as well. So we're able to have pretty complex argumentation that's mapped out using this specific tool. And then of course we want to model it. And like I said, of the knowledge products that the Society Library produces, creating these maps is just one thing. We're really interested in creating like much more accessible visual libraries, apps. I would love to put it in VR. How fun would it be to like stretch and open claims to unpack them? It would be lovely. I would love to take some of our data and like maybe work with someone who would have an interest in visualizing these things. I think it could be lovely. But the other things that we do, like I mentioned, we create decision-making models. So we're moving into the smart city space. Like we're trying to pitch it like smart cities, you know, could be smarter if they had ways to augment their intelligence by externalizing the decision-making process. Some of the work that we've already done, you know, I mentioned earlier that something that we've discovered in our work is when you really map a space, you find out how dense and complex it is. So a city council wrote to us and they asked us to help map a debate that they were having locally, and they thought it was a binary issue, like yes or no. And we found there was over 25 different dimensions of the decision that they were facing, and there was anywhere from 2 to 5 arguments with or without evidence in each one of those dimensions that they would consider. So we created a micro voting protocol that essentially allowed them to zero in on one dimension at a time. And the feedback that we got from that project was just so wonderful. You know, people who felt like they were being marginalized felt that they were heard. People who felt like they were on the fence, like we're finally able to see that they were actually like really certain of a specific position. They just need to externalize it. So we're moving in that space and we're pitching to various city councils to essentially not only do work, research work for them, like the Library of Congress does for Congress, but also create these decision-making models, because that can increase transparency and accountability in decision-making. And it helps overcome a little bit of cognitive bias, because if we're making decisions in our heads, who knows what kind of black box calculations and weighting is actually going on. But if we're forced to externalize it and work with things one-on-one and like actually like identify what dimensions we're in agreement with, it just, I think, helps improve the process in some way, at least a little bit. So we're hoping that we can just like improve decision making in general. And then we've also been hired to create legislation. So using our method of deconstructing content down to the claim level, we've produced federal level legislation. We essentially took hundreds of pages of congressional recommendations, broke them down to the claim level, and then we compared those with legislation that was passed, failed, and pending at the state and federal level in order to essentially say what in the congressional recommendations on the specific issue is missing from the existing legal code at the federal level, and then borrow language from where it's been attempted in the past and produce a bill just essentially by claim matching and filling in the blanks. So we were willing to work on something like this because it was a very nonpartisan issue. It had to do with it was an infrastructure bill. It had to do with the integrity of the electrical grid in the United States and recommendations to harden or make it more resilient. So it's a totally nonpartisan issue. We were happy to do it. And we also got amazing feedback from that work. We were able to literally deconstruct hundreds of pieces of legislation and hundreds of pages of congressional recommendations in under 3 weeks and deliver this this proposal. So most likely we'll continue doing like nonpartisan legislative work. And then also we think that some of the data sets that we're creating may actually be very useful training data, not just for us, but for other people as well. So we're thinking about that also being a potential revenue stream as a nonprofit. And so I think with all that being said, I can move on to actually showing you real, oh, one more thing. So I mentioned before, I don't know how to click back on this, that this debate mapping software has a lot of different features. We can pack videos and images and quotes and equations and references and all these different things in a single node. And so what we made, when we made a submission to the Future of Text book, it was about our concept of web-based conceptual portmanteau. So I'm going to show you a little bit of what that looks like when we were initially mocking it up. And then by the end of this presentation, I'm going to show you where we're at currently, because I think it's a huge improvement. So our first foray into web-based conceptual portmanteau is we were essentially saying, you know, portmanteau is when you combine a couple words together and it's like this more complex, meaningful word. And we're like, okay, well, we're trying to create a portmanteau in terms of media assets. We want to combine references with images and videos and text and different variant phrases of the text and all these different things. So we kind of mocked up this new node structure. And we were talking about different ways in which people could unpack and repack all of that knowledge. I'm going to show you our debate map and kind of take you through a little bit, and then I'll show you the new version of web-based conceptual portmanteau, which is still being a little like tinkered with currently, but I'm happy to show you a little bit of what we're doing. So here's an example of one of the debates that we're going to be pushing out. This is the data staging area. So you're very much seeing like behind the scenes. These are our tools that our databrarians and librarians use to input structured knowledge. And I'm going to show you how complex it gets. So we were asked to map the deliberation about the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant in the United States. It's the last one in California that's in operation. And there's a great big debate about it. I think even like Elon Musk has alluded to it in tweets. So it's like kind of a high profile issue for the state of California. And we were very lucky to be asked to start mapping it before it kind of like really, really blew up. So what we found so far is that there's generally like two fundamental questions that the community has, which is what should happen to the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant and why is it being decommissioned? I put little trophies as notes to myself so I don't get lost. And so far what we found is there's about 7 different positions that the community is taking on these issues. And by community, I mean, we mean academics from MIT, we mean the governor, we mean activists, we mean members of the local community. Essentially, we had an interest in finding all the different stakeholders, checking out the media that they were producing, and then extracting that media. This data set, I believe, is drawing knowledge from 880 different media artifacts. I have a list here. In this database is references to knowledge from 51 scholarly articles, 8 TV segments, 112 reports, 5 books and textbooks, 367 news and websites, 194 social media posts, 66 videos, 24 podcasts, 53 government international documents, together for 880. And so far what we found is there's 7 general positions. One of those is that it should just be left to be decommissioned as scheduled. And then we see that this kind of breaks up into a variety of different categories. So there's economic issues, environmental issues, safety and well-being issues, ethical issues, all in support of why it should be decommissioned as scheduled. So as we unpack this, we can actually start seeing some of the reasons that people pose, some of the reasons that people pose for why it should be commissioned. And you may notice that there's these little brackets right here. Those brackets are important because in order for us to translate data from this data set to the visualizations that we've created, we're actually substituting these lines, which are indicators that are the relationship between nodes with this language. So what we're doing is, even though we're just kind of like creating this knowledge graph structure, and these lines and their colors and orientation are indicators of their relationship, we actually will substitute it with that language so it's completely readable and not as visual. Some of these claims in support of it being decommissioned that are related to economic issues include that closing the plant won't harm the local economy as much as previously thought, and that market forces have made the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant redundant and non-competitive. So we can unpack this even more. And again, in brackets means that we're essentially identifying, I know it like unpacks and it's a little jittery. It's identifying the relationship between this text snippet and this other text snippet. So as we move on from this one, which won't hurt the local economy as much as we thought, the economic impact of the local economy will be smaller than previous estimates, in part due to economic resources that will be made available. And over time, the region will overcome economically and experience positive growth. Now, I'm just going to take a moment to kind of start unpacking a little bit of what's available in this node. So what you're seeing is this text and these references here, but we also actually have is a bunch of different phrases, maybe a bunch of different ways of expressing the exact same point in a similar linguistic register. So we've identified that as standard. We also want to make all of these nodes really accessible to people with like less subject matter familiarity and can handle less cognitive complexity. So this simple version is like, it uses much more simple vocabulary. It says, even though it seems like there will be a lot of bad economic consequences when the plant closes down, some experts think it won't be that bad. So it's like a very simple way of expressing the same point. And we have some more technical versions of this claim that actually refer to the economic assessment, why that assessment was commissioned, what kind of, here, let me actually open it so you can see. What type of specific like input output modeling tool was used to derive those conclusions. Like, it's a much more technical way of expressing that same claim. And then in support of this particular claim, we have a multi-premise right here. I'm kind of break it down. This right here, which actually breaks, this is the summary of the multi-premise, which we can unpack here, that actually breaks down the logical argumentation that led to this particular conclusion. So every single stage of not the experimentation, but the conclusion. So the first step of the decommissioning process will result in this kind of economic growth, and we'll have economic losses, then we'll have economic benefits. Overall, it will conclude thus. And this can unpack even further, because each one of these premises in this argument can also have pro-con argumentation that can argue whether it's true, support it, or refute its relevance. Like we have an example of a relevance argument here, which calls out that the economic impact assessment didn't look at the economic impact after the decommissioning of the plant was complete. So when it talked about positive economic growth, it was only so far out of a projection, and they didn't include certain things in their model. And of course, this comes from a news article. So it's about collaboratively finding where the conversation is happening, distributed across different media artifacts, and then bringing that argumentation actually close together in one spot for people to explore. I'll show another little example, and there's tons of these, so like based on market forces, demand for CCP, nuclear energy is expected to decline. We have another multi-press here, which essentially breaks down all of the different economic trends that are happening, which have been collaboratively expressed. So it's not just that energy efficiency policies are going to reduce overall electricity consumption. There's also increased solar, and then CCAs also don't prefer to buy nuclear energy. And as you can see, it can get pretty dense pretty quickly, because all of these are unique arguments that support these kind of more vague, generalizable premises. So the more that we kind of go upstream and go left, the more vague the statements are, and the more interested someone is into actually like digging into the argumentation and evidence that's available to support these like vaguer, high level, like commonly expressed sentiments. People can really dive in deep and explore. But of course, like this begs the question, why on earth would anyone do this or want to find like knowledge like organized this way? And even though when we publish this collection, we're going to have a viewable version of this map accessible. If people love to explore this map, hopefully we'll figure out the functionality a little bit, so it'll center things and make it a little bit better. But we know that this isn't really going to cut it in terms of making this accessible, legible, etc. So what I'm really excited about, going back to the web-based conceptual portmanteau, we've been wondering, how can we take all of this knowledge and like really compress it down? So I'm going to show you a sneak peek. I wasn't originally going to show it because this is recorded, and I didn't want this to end up on YouTube yet. So I'm just going to show you one image and just give you a little taste of it.
Tell us when we post it to YouTube. It doesn't have to be immediately.
Okay.
So just give us a date afterwards.
I mean, I'll just give you a little taste of it. So this is actually what we call Society Library papers. So, and this is just the design mock-up, like we're building it right now, but we've figured out a lot of different features that I'm really excited about, and we're hopefully going to have more time to test it and make sure that like it's actually as usable as we think it is. So actually a lot of knowledge can be compressed in a paper. And what we're doing is actually allowing the paper itself to unpack in different dimensions. And by clicking on different snippets, like each one of these are arguments, it can open up different screens where people can view the variant phrases and things like that. So we're going to drastically simplify and compress a lot of this knowledge while maintaining all of the complexity, but making it more of like a bulleted outline that opens up in different, like opens up and closes back up as people want to dive in deep to each one of these sections. And we want to have ways in which people can track how much of it they've seen, etc. There's other ways in which we're thinking about visualizing content too. But that still needs to be fleshed out more before I'm excited to share it. Although there's things like I really think, just like we are figuring out all the ways in which we can have all the complexity and features of this debate map in a piece of paper, I think we'll be able to do the same with video. And if some magical VR magician comes by and wants to take this data and start changing it with visualizations as well, I think experimenting with it in VR is going to be very important for us as well. So I think those are all my tabs that I had an interest in showing you all. 45 minutes in, wow. So I think it's a good time to pause and ask, you all have been thinking about these issues longer than we have. What should we be learning? What have we missed? Who should we be learning from? Would love your feedback, and thank you all for your attention and time too.
Yeah, thank you. That was intense. And our wonderful human transcriber is going to work overtime on your presentation. Danilo, excuse me. He is very good, so it'll be fine. I'm going to start with the worst question just to get that out of the way. And that is, you know, you're American, we're British, you had Trump, we have Boris Johnson. It seems a lot of that politics is just personality based. Oh, I like him, or some kind of a statement like that. Where would you fit that in here? Or do you consider that for this out of scope?
I mean, to a certain extent, I think there's certain things that are relevant and some of it is out of scope. So one thing I just want to acknowledge is that I think we're in the middle of an epistemic movement. So there's a lot of people who are working on different dimensions of like, how can we have an epistemic revolution? I like to call it the enlightenment. So how can we use new technology to like transform our relationship with information?
Hang on, enlightenment. Has anyone else on the call heard that expression before? That's pretty cool. Let's just underline that. The enlightenment. Okay, that's wonderful.
That was the name of my TED talk. Yeah, so I call it the enlightenment.
Oh, no, you catched us not having seen your TED talk. Now we have to watch it. Okay, fair enough.
No, it's old. It's not amazing. I really want to redo it. If I redo it, I'm going to call it something like big data democracy and talk about like the complexity and volume and density of like our social deliberations and how we need new like tools to really like have experience our big data society in the way in which it actually exists in reality. But anyway. Yeah, so I think some things are relevant, some things are out of scope. There's a lot of people who are working on different dimensions of these issues. And one of the contributions that the Society Library is making outside of knowledge projects is also education. We've been working at the university level. We're trying to bring it down to high school. And then we've been collaborating with some people, ideating how we can start kind of like epistemic appreciation, like learning about cognitive biases and logical fallacies and the various ways in which you can be disinformed on the internet into like younger and younger children's programming to kind of develop a literacy and a standard for, you know, what we should appreciate in terms of like high quality work versus not high quality work. And obviously like there's people who are working on making social media less effective and less addictive. So there's lots of different people who are working on this. And you're right that I think a lot of politics is about personality. So what I think about often is, okay, well, how do we essentially make smart really sexy in the United States? So like once we have these knowledge products, you kind of have to create the demand for people to want to use them. So what kind of people need to associate with these knowledge yes, we do. So I didn't mention, thank you for your question, Peter. We have a tagging feature and we use our tags and it actually appears on the paper. So when someone unpacks a node in the paper and we have a tag on it, it appears as a handwritten note off to the side in the marginalia that just lets people know like, hey, this is an opinion, this needs to be fact checked, this is cherry picked data, etc. So sorry, I saw your note. And just wanted to answer that really quickly. But
oops. I know Scotland. Okay, now hang on. We lost you for a second there. I know Scotland can be cold, but your connection was frozen.
Oh, okay.
You're
Can you
back.
hear me again now?
Yeah, back.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how do we create the personalities, you know, fictional or not? Like these could be in kids shows, for example. How do we create the personality and personas that are sexy and attractive, that are pointing people towards the cultural values of appreciating more rigorous research, higher standard for argumentation and these sorts of things? So yeah, so and some of our donors and supporters have been thinking about this also and thinking about supporting subsequent and related projects to help drive up demand for people appreciating this. And something that we see in the Trump era in the United States is that there's been a huge decrease in trust. Whether this, I think this was happening well before Trump. I think Trump kind of was a consequence of this happening, but I think he also helped make it a little bit worse. There's been mass amounts of distrust in existing knowledge institutions. So like news media and universities, government agencies, these sorts of things. People are not as trusting, some sections of the population are not as trusting to get their information from those institutions. However, I think libraries very interestingly have maintained their level of trust in American society. So we do recognize that there is an element of branding and storytelling to be attractive to the community. It's probably gonna be a very long form relationship development. And that's one of the reasons why the Society Library takes its culture so seriously. We take our virtues and values so seriously is because we are going to be an institution that isn't going to get thrown away immediately. That means we have to always have the out-facing communication, the branding, the look, and the integrity to earn and maintain that trust.
On that issue, on the fake news, this is a phenomenal guide to fake news as opposed to propaganda.
Well,
It basically makes the simple, obvious statement that when Russia first invaded Ukraine, the point of fake news was not wrong news. It was simply wrong and true mixed, so no one would believe the media. And of course, clever people like to think, oh, I don't trust the BBC. And you know, the situation we are in today, which is pretty awful. And then I have a very specific kind of semi-technical question. This goes back to having conversations with Marc-Antoine, of course. And that is the last thing you showed, that normal document where you can click and things open. That is, of course, phenomenal. And it is something that we in this community, we really like the idea of being able to get a summary and then digging into it. So my question to you is, in what way is it open and interconnected? So can I use it in my academic document? Can Fabien use it in a VR environment? And can Marc-Antoine, I guess you can, extract it into his knowledge graph? How does this data move around?
Well, good question. So all the data coming from DebateMap can be, referenced and extricated elsewhere. The paper document is so brand spanking new, we haven't even thought about it integrating it with other platforms. So we're still like wrapping it up as we speak. When it's finished, though, I would love to start inquiring into how it can be not only maybe productized so other people could use it. Essentially, it would require a different interface to input data, most likely, because I can't imagine people are going to quickly get up to speed with our really complex debate map. So creating a user-facing product input form to structure that will probably be more helpful to others. So I don't have an answer to your question yet. I would love for it to be productized and for it to be ported elsewhere, but the debate map does that data can be extracted and referenced and all of that through an API.
Marc-Antoine, do you have anything to add to that from your, okay.
Okay. I'm not part of that team.
No, but since since you guys have a good dialogue. Okay.
We certainly both believe in the value of making these new ways of expressing information, both in continuous text and in graphs, and making them interrelated. How interrelated, there's many models, and I think we're both separately and together exploring ways to do these interrelations. Certainly the ability to tag concepts or arguments in text, I doubt very much that it won't be connected to the graph realization. And that way, if you have an export from the graph, the question is, can you identify these things in the text document, right? And then we can speak about offline annotation, we can speak about edition, we can speak about, somebody mentioned stretch text in the notes. Yes, I believe in that. I believe in side-by-side views personally. These are, having the graph with the text coordinated. That's something I'm pursuing. As I said, I'm not part of that team. I don't know how Jamie's doing that part. I am helping her more with the extraction a bit. So, yeah.
Very much so. Well, you can join the team, Marc-Antoine. I'd love to get your thoughts. We've just been so swamped in the world of design. I didn't even think about tapping on your shoulder, but I always love working with you.
Yes, you too. Yes. So, okay, I'll do something controversial then and show you something. So,
yes.
Just briefly, most of the people here know this all too well. This is the most poverty-stricken thing I could possibly show you, but it's about an approach, not a specific thing. I'll do really briefly. In the beginning of documents in a book, you normally have a bit of metadata. PDFs, of course, normally never have anything. So this approach that we call visual meta is to take metadata on the last page, right? So this obviously wasn't made for you, so I'll just show you a few brief things and mention the relevance. It is formatted to look like BibTeX. And that just means it looks, it's really, really simple, right? So this example here happens to be for the ACM Hypertext Symposium, conference last year and this year. And I'll stop sharing, not to get too sidetracked, but the idea is that all we do when we export to PDF is write at the back of the document what the metadata is, And that includes, first of all, who wrote it. Because very often an academic article, you know, when you download it, you don't even know the date it was published because it's from a specific bit of the journal. It also includes structural metadata, i.e. headings. They can also include who wrote the headings and what levels. And then they can include references. So all of this is in the metadata that we then take into VR or wherever and use it. So one thing you might consider, and this is something we'd love to work with you, but if you do it entirely by yourself, that's fine. All the stuff you have when you do that top level presentation, just stick it in the appendix. As long as you explain in the beginning what it is in normal human language, let's say in 500 years, when someone comes across the PDF and everything else is dead, they can reconstruct it.
Yep. I checked out some of, it was, I think one of your explainer videos on it, and I just gotta say, I absolutely love it. I love it.
No, I'm glad you do, and thank you. I mean, we every couple of months, there's a circle of arguments of, oh, we shouldn't use PDF. We don't just use PDF. It depends where you're doing stuff. When we go into VR, we use different formats, but at the end of the day, you got to archive something. And that's why, you know, it's used by billions of documents. Somebody will keep it going. So when it comes to the finish bit, so yeah, you know that whole workflow. So yeah, I'm just glad we had that that little back and forth. Any other questions? And by the way, David and Carl, it looks like you're wearing the same hat. It's so funny because of the green background.
Oh, that's funny. Yes. Nice.
Okay.
I had a question, Jamie. Where are you headed with the visualization on screens?
I mean, so we're working on creating this multi-dimensional, explorable and interactive piece of paper. And then I think we're going to move on to recreating the newspaper and recreating TV as well. So all of the ways in which, because again, like all of those nodes can be the ones that have video content because we clip it, where the expression of the claim is associated in video with the node itself. So as especially we get more and more sophisticated with automating some of our processes and making sure each one of the nodes are actually multimedia, I think the same kind of way of compressing and like compounding into like a dense layered like interactive set can be translated across medias. So I'm really excited about that. But again, I can't, you know, not state enough how interested we would be in creating a VR library, because I think that would be so exciting, or a VR debate. I think that's really important. So we're just like tinkering right now, and we're just finishing up the last like really complex argumentation structures and creating corresponding paper features and visualizations for that. And we're looking to push it out by the end of this month. And then we'll get, you know, test and get feedback and see how useful it is and all of that.
That's super cool. I look forward to seeing that.
That's really wonderful. I see Fabian has his hand up, which is great because I was about to call on him. I was just going to say two things in context for Fabian. Number one, we're doing some basic murals in VR now, and even just a flat mural is really powerful. And we're looking at all kinds of interactions, but also we do meet every Monday and Friday. All of you should feel free to dip in and out as you have time, because right now we're at the stage where we're learning how to do a folding or a this and a that. So we're at the detail level, which could be really quite exciting. Fabian, please.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the presentation. What I wanted to say, so I have a presentation due for this group. Name, what if a librarian could move the walls around? That I think could be quite, yeah, it should pique your interest. But I give a little spoiler for this presentation, which is to say, in my opinion, even if your, for example, your information or your data structure is very well organized, it might not be the most interesting for participants, because that might become a little bit boring. Like if it's too structured, let's say, a little bit like if you go to a hospital or a large public building, if every floor is a copy paste of the other, we get lost basically. So, I mean, being structured is extremely powerful, and we can process and we can do quite a bit with it, but I don't think it's sufficient. It's not a criticism in any form of way, just I'm saying today, let's say if you give me the data set, I can definitely make like an infinite corridor, a very long corridor with all the information. But yes, I think it would be fun to do, but I think it's not sufficient. I think you will experience it, have a form of way to be through it. But one of the at least my motivation for VR reporting text or documents or information in VR is how smart our body is and how we can remember when we've been to, like I was mentioning, a bakery in Berkeley, because I haven't been for a while, but I did go, and I remember how to get there and how to go in the bathroom of a friend. This kind of just mind-blowing stuff that any of us, every one of us can do. But because we have some kind of like richness of the environment, diversity, so it's a bit of a word of warning to say porting it to VR. It's definitely feasible today. It's not a problem. It would definitely be valuable and interesting, but it would probably be quite interesting or more valuable to consider what 3D assets do you have? Is there actually a structure behind, let's say, an argument map? Can you actually visualize it, not to visualize it, but in a way that you mentioned knowledge compression, that you can synthesize in a way that is meaningful, not just to spatialize it in order to spatialize it, but to spatialize it because that mapping or that visualization makes sense. So I think that's a little bit the challenge there. And again, I say this candidly or naively. I don't have, sadly, an obvious or an immediate answer to this, but in my opinion, that's where the challenge would be.
Yeah, no, I absolutely completely agree. And when you mentioned how intelligent our bodies are, what immediately came to mind is how when we were looking at different visualizations for the data on essentially like, you know, a 2D screen where we can't like interact with it in a, you know, three-dimensional space, so to speak, I was trying to find a lot of inspiration from video games. So I was looking at a lot of video games of how they compress knowledge and organize, like, you know, they have all their accessories and this is how they upgrade their armor and blah, blah, blah. So I was looking at tons of those. And what I was really interested and inspired by were these things called star charts. So there are ways in which people can develop their character where they move through a three-dimensional space of lighting up nodes. And it essentially shows that they're headed in a specific direction. It shows them enough of what's ahead of them so they know to like move in a direction. Final Fantasy does this, for example. And they also know there's a whole other section over here of undeveloped like traits because their character is moving in a specific direction. And so when I was thinking about our argument maps, if we were to take those trees and essentially lay that out in physical space, is there some kind of metaphorical thing that we can pull from real life that would map onto people's brains really easily so that they could use their geospatial intelligence to kind of not only remember the content, but be interacting with it a little bit more? And I couldn't help but think like essentially roads. So all of these different signs that would indicate if you want to go to economic here, blah, 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 here, blah, 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 here, and they could be taking a walk through the debate. And it could be an enjoyable experience because there could be lots of delightful things along the way that they could be seeing as they're walking in the direction of the economic arguments. There's another signpost with all the different signs pointing in different directions. They take this one, etc. There's a map up on the corner showing them what territory they've explored. This is something that exists in video games. And I mean, given the structure of our data in debate map, it seems as though so long as like similar to how we're designing all of the assets in the paper to unlock and unfold and split up and blah, blah, blah. If those similar assets could be rendered in a 3D space, you could just map out entire territories of physical traversable space. So I don't know, given that you're an expert, if you think an idea like that could be worthwhile, but I completely agree with you that just like visualizing it as like books or something on a shelf isn't going to do it because we're a different kind of society now. And so part of the reason, you know, why we conceptualize this idea of conceptual web-based conceptual portmanteau is that we know that like we have to develop new media to express knowledge. We can't just directly digitize books or pages or essays or newspapers anymore. It's multidimensional. Frode, I think you're muted.
I was. There is a really interesting, however, which we experienced recently. Bob Horn gave us a mural that we put in VR. And if you pull it towards you and push it, no problem. But if you walk, it's so easy to get queasy. Motion sickness for so many of us can happen. So the idea of walking down a road is great for some, but it can easily just not go. But also, before I hand it over to Mark here, Brandel forced me to buy this book last time by holding it up. That's how we force each other here.
Cool.
The introduction is not very good. It really threw me off because she's a journalist. However, when you get to the chapters, the embodied thinking and so on is absolutely phenomenal. I think you would greatly appreciate it. But yeah, so the reason I highlighted that point is me having been in VR only 3 months now, properly on and off, I had so many preconceptions that are just getting slaughtered.
Okay.
So to work with Fabienne, with such rich, deep experience, and also with Brandel, who's working on these things, to really learn to see differently, we have to reevaluate this. For a while, we called what we're working on metaverse, but just looking at the proper definition, that's all about the social space. What we're doing in this group is not so much social and definitely not gaming as such. It is about working in virtual environments, and it seems hardly anybody's focused on that. So for you to come into this dialogue with actual data, actual use case, actual needs, adds really wonderful questions. So I want to thank you very much.
Yeah, and thank you for that advice, and thank you, Fabian, too. Are there meetings that maybe I could sit in on so I could benefit from this sage insight and experience of translating things to VR?
They only say sorry.
Sorry to interrupt, but did you, to be very direct, did you put a VR headset for the last couple of years?
It's probably been about a year since I've put one on my face.
Okay, but you did, so that's fine, because I think honestly, with all the due respect to everybody around here, putting the headset once recently is more valuable than any or all of our meetings. And then coming in and then discussing and then proposing a data set then is definitely valuable. Yeah, but that's the first step. You've done that part, or you'll get it.
Yeah, I've played some games. I've done. I love the painting games a lot, actually. That's pretty fun.
Oh, very good. Just to answer your question about sit in, you're all invited to just be in any of the meetings. It is the same time. It should be 4 to 6 UK time, but you Americans move the whole clock. So, we follow you right now. We will catch up with you. But, sit in and say nothing, speak, whatever you feel like. It's just a warm community. Dr. Anderson.
Okay, well, thanks. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I love to hear someone just mentioning the idea of a data set, because given the deconstruction you're doing, there's something really interesting there. At the moment when people talk about data set, that just means something I scraped out of an Excel spreadsheet and shoved in a box, and I now think it's worth money. That's fundamentally not, I think, what data is. And it's really interesting too, for this whole thing of VR, one of the things, so I'm kind of completely new, I suppose, what's 2 months, I guess, since I looked at any modern VR, and I've been using the Oculus. And then one of the things I'm really seeing is that lots of things that you'd think would work just won't. So take pretty much any 2D visualization you've thought of. It's not going to be instantly better for seeing it with an extra D in it. That's for certain. Which is in effect why the data is so much more interesting. So rather than think, how do I make this picture, this 2D picture appear in 3D? It's with all this richness, how can I see things that I can't show photos? Anyway, probably selling that preached and converted there. Just a couple of thoughts that are going to seem rather cheeky, and I feel bad about it because they're only possible to make given the massive amount of work you've done and the wonderful deconstruction of the arguments. But I suppose the hypertext sort of researcher and used to looking at nonlinear paths is I was thinking, does your deconstruction process show you where the same sources or the same arguments occur multiple points in the graph? Because I think that becomes useful. And also the whole Johari window problem of the unknown unknowns. So one can put an awful, there is a danger, and we're all sort of prone to it, is that because it takes time to do this, by the time you've mapped everything out, that seems like the known world. And I constantly have to sort of force myself to sort of say, that's just the bit I know. Now let's look at what I think. So I don't know if there's an answer to that, but it's an interesting challenge. And the one other thing I was thinking about, prompted by the thought of changing views about how we trust data and sources and things, is we seem to have moved into a sort of world where there's massive first mover advantage in being the first to complain, for instance. So there's moral ascendancy in being the first person to call the other person bad, regardless of the truth of the situation. And it also I've seen a thing creeping in where, if there are 2 pros and 1 con, or vice versa, that's seen as actually being an empirical measure of worth. How do you how do you sort of cope with that, or does the deconstruction model not attempt that? Because I'm not saying it should, but what are your feelings on that side of things?
Yes. Okay. So there's a couple different things that you said. I'm going to try and remember and respond to them all. So one, can the system understand that the sources are the same? Yes, but there's no like features built on top of that to make that easy. And it's deceptively linear because we can actually copy and paste nodes all across it, and it does link all around. And if we update one, it updates the other, et cetera. So it's kind of like deceptively linear. But it definitely could be more rich and useful as a knowledge graph if we built features to actually like filter content like that. We don't currently do that. The other thing that you mentioned, about known, knowns, and unknowns. So actually, like, we've had extensive conversation at the Society Library about this very thing, because we have this technique called devil's advocacy research. It's something we borrowed from the CIA. So if you take a claim and you just invert it to its opposite, and then you go and try and steel man that, like, that's a CIA technique, at least as recent as 2009. And so because we generate so many claims, like I think our climate change database is like 396,000 claims of a single expression, not like variant phrases, but like single expression. We could just invert all of those and have a whole other set. And then there's, of course, you don't just invert things in a binary sense. There's all these shades of gray in between. There's all these adjectives that you could add that slightly change the meaning of a claim. So there's a lot that we could do there to essentially, once we have the set that we have, the known knowns, to invert, slightly adjust, to drastically expand that. And then what we could show as a visualization, and we've thought about this, like, would it be a useful epistemic tool to show people, like, this is what we were able to steel man, but these are all the different research questions we have that we were just able to generate that are relevant to a certain extent. It's not just nonsense created by GPT-3, right? Like, it could be relevant, and we haven't done the work yet. And we didn't know if that would increase intellectual humility and curiosity, or that would be like really disincentivizing and discouraging. So it's beyond our organizational capacity to do that experiment, but we have been thinking about it and are interested. When it comes to trust, first movers, I mean, I see that currently, that people, I see people coming into this space and being the first movers of complainers. And I was like, I'm seeing them rise in popularity, and it's very interesting to watch, but I can't remember why you brought that up.
Well, it's about this sort of, it bleeds into this point about sort of people getting overly empirical. So I've seen two supporting things. So clearly that's more than one countervailing argument. Yeah. So in other words, so the user, the learner from this, not actually learning, they actually have to evaluate. Having got to these sources, they actually have to evaluate them. It's not so much of just counting up the pros and cons.
Yes. I'm going to quickly see if I can pull this up really fast. So we've been thinking about that also. And one of the reasons why we have tags is to start qualifying things. So we'll call out if an argument is like, has no evidence and is just an opinion, or is logical fallacy, or yada, yada, yada. Because we're trying to combat some of those cognitive biases. And so one of the things that we want to do, as clunky as this is, hopefully I can pull it up soon, otherwise I'll just skip it. As clunky of an idea as this is, we do have an intro video where we're going to try and prime people to not fall for these different cognitive biases, to like tell them explicitly, do not like fall for this trick. Having more does not mean like this is better argumentation or what have you. Like, do not fall for this trick. So before anyone gets into, let me quickly share my screen again. We're thinking about making it so that you can't even unlock the paper, map, decision, or library until you like play a video that kind of helps inoculate against that. And something that I've been just personally wondering is, can cognitive biases cancel each other out? So if people are, one, more likely to remember the first thing they read, but they're also more likely to remember things that are negative, should we always show the con positions or like the no positions at the end? And should we, in these intro videos, like tell them like, there's no way that we can get around some of these biases because they're hardwired in our brains. We're just primed for them. So we've organized things in this way. If you think it's biased, it's because it is, but we're trying to counteract this other bias. So we're trying to find like, is there a communication medium, whether asking them to watch a video or have like a little character pop up, a little tiny robot librarian bloop up and be like, hey, just so you know, like we did this for this reason because humans are biased and flawed and we're just really trying to get you to enlightenment here. We're thinking about it. We have no great answer. And we do have a partner at Harvard and NYU who offered to run like a polarization study to see if the way that we map content can depolarize attitudes. So we are interested in partnering with universities to like really rigorously test some of the features that we're thinking about, just to see like what does it have a pro-social positive impact, because we're not interested in persuading anyone. We're not interested in driving anyone towards any conclusions. We just have like the librarian goal of enabling enlightenment through access to information. And for us, enlightenment means like essentially open mind through depolarized attitudes, inoculation against disinformation, intellectual humility, increased subject matter knowledge, and increased comprehension of complexity. So just overall, like more curiosity and open-mindedness and comprehension without being inflicted by like bad attitudes and polarization and disinformation and things like that.
Well, that's lovely to hear, actually. And I'm thinking, of course, that again, the joy of your having such a deep and rich data set is, for instance, although you can't necessarily answer some of the stuff on these biases, right, there's a lovely substrate for someone to work on. So that's another. I mean, this is again where I think people fail to see where the real value in the data is. It's not like you're going to sell this to somebody. It's the fact that that's just hours of dedicated work, and especially doing it from a, you know, in a sense, a neutral, for want of a better word, but standpoint, which is tremendously important, because you rightly say, I mean, if you've got some bias in there, or if you've got more than a trivial amount of bias in there to start with, then will they understand? And just because I see hands up, one final thought is, when you mentioned the fact that, yes, you know, inputs to turn up across the piece, that, for instance, might be an area where having extra dimensions of visualization might be exploitable.
Yeah,
because it's really hard to do on a flat surface, because the worst thing is you just end up with lines all over the place, and it's all totally complicated. But I think that one of the things that's emerging in our sort of explorations of the VR is its ability to, you don't necessarily have to remove things. It's reducing the salience of some things, dialing it up on others. So it's all there. It's all somewhere in the space, perhaps. But what you're seeing is the connection that's pertinent at the time. In other words, it's a different sort of interaction. You ask for the thing you're interested in knowing and bring it forward. Of course, thinking that and making that are, you know, the journey we're on at the moment.
Oh,
but
yeah.
Thanks, super. I find that really interesting, and I'll see the floor, Peter.
Thanks for your questions, Mark.
Excellent. Hey, Jamie. So my question is, well, the premise of it is that what you're producing is going to be incredibly valuable. I'm just making that assumption. And I'm also looking at it and just seeing, it seems like there's just such a tremendous amount of work that goes into just one inquiry. And what I'm wondering is, what does it take right now, for example, to do something like the California nuclear plant, and both in kind of human resources as well as elapsed time? And then I'm also wondering what you foresee in the future in terms of being able to streamline that with both automation and potentially AI. You know, what are you shooting for in terms of human resources and the elapsed time? And then the third part of that is decentralization at all on your radar, in that possibility of bringing in a much larger group of analysts to do certain pieces of the work?
Yep, great set of questions. So I believe the Diablo Canyon power plant project is about 10 weeks old. We got 2 more weeks left to wrap it all up, and that was inventing the paper visualization along the way. We had 4 full-time analysts. I was a part-time analyst. So it was kind of a small team in a relatively quick period of time. And I think we owe a lot of that to the tools we built ahead of time in the past and our methodology. So, and the fact that we have years of experience training students through our educational curriculum. So we know how to train people to like quickly understand debate map, quickly understand what we mean by claim, use the tools to find content. But I honestly think a lot of the different tasks, not the work, I think we're going to be working with librarians and human analysts for a long time, but I think a lot of the tasks, discrete tasks, can be automated. We're tinkering with some of those right now. I'm fundraising for some of that right now. I've got a lot of ideas about what's possible. yeah, in both like claim mining, syllogism generation, mass deconstruction, like there's a whole bunch of ideas that I have, and like there's already tools that exist that we could be experimenting with more. So I'm excited about that. You mentioned decentralization. I think there was a question in between that. So with decentralization, so the trick, the thing is that like language is so flexible and dense, and some people are not very precise in their expression. So it depends upon the knowledge that you are working with, first of all, because we're working across different media types. There's a lot of flexibility in that language. There's a lot of ways in which people can misinterpret, they can imply, they can bias the interpretation. So if we were to welcome like more of a crowd, there would be discrete tasks that I would allocate to them. But I would not trust a crowd to be responsible for the emergent structuring of a deliberation. And that's because unless this entire crowd is somehow really well trained in understanding what is relevant argumentation and what is not relevant argumentation, you're going to end up with a humongous spaghettified mess. Like if you look at existing platforms, I've looked at a lot of platforms. If you look at existing platforms, you'll notice that the argumentation is either like very vague enough where a lot of the relevance can be applied, or it's like not really like fine enough in terms of like actually establishing the logical relationship between the points, even if the points are more specific. So it's not to like the level of rigor that we're interested in at the Society Library. And that's because like the knowledge products that we're looking to create, even though we're creating the options for people to simplify things, right? Simplify this and put it into simple variant phrasing, for example, just give me the gist of it. We want to give people that option. We actually want to do as rigorous work as we possibly can in terms of deconstructing arguments into their premises and conclusions. Because I feel like if you don't do that, then it's always going to yield more and more argumentation because people will misunderstand what's implied. So if you actually pull apart the argument, like this is every single stage of what we mean, this is all the data that supports those things, maybe it allows some tiny small subsection of readers to really appreciate that more. A lot of people are not going to want that level of detail. Just give me the gist so I can see and make my decision, blah, blah, blah. So there are certain things I think the crowd could do really well. I think archiving is something the crowd could do really well. I think tagging is something the crowd could do really well. Modeling argumentation, I think that's a really high skill. I think that's a really like technical skill, and I wouldn't trust like 100,000 people to do that in a meaningful way. I already get in wiki wars on Wikipedia, for example, and that's just an encyclopedia page, and there's no rigorous rules about the relationship between sentences in Wikipedia, and yet like people still fight about that. So yeah, that's my point on that. Yeah, partly crowdsourced in principle. That's right. I mean, I agree. There's parts of it that could be crowdsourced, like finding the topics, getting the resources, finding how topics and base arguments appear in certain resources. So again, archiving and tagging, I think is a great crowd job, but modeling, I think, requires a lot of skill and a lot of like editorial review. Like I review the work of all of the analysts. We review each other's work. In the future, I want us to have more of an intercoded system where a lot of the work is actually redundantly performed, the same people performing the exact same task, so we can actually see the difference and see if that difference is statistically significant. There are people who built distributed content analysis platforms that I really like. They're friends of ours. They collaborate with us on certain things. I'm not yet finished with fine-tuning our method enough to know what we want to have a part of distributed content analysis and what can be automated. So maybe a few more iterations down, we'll have the right combination of like, okay, we're going to hard code this modeling into something that is distributed, and then also have like, the AI help us with certain discrete tasks and maybe a crowd. We've been poked and provoked to do a DAO as well. So I don't know if we will, but.
The question that was in between was actually related to the first question. And okay. in the best of all worlds, where do you see the like elapsed time getting to?
Oh yeah.
Because especially when we're talking about a culture with this first complaint dynamic happening, it's like getting this information out quickly, I think could be really valuable.
Yeah, I think I like to think and try to orient our work towards constantly imagining it being possible instantaneously. There being a constant monitoring, construction, and modeling that's happening. I think we're really far away from that. But that's what I would like to get to, is essentially like the Society Library being a large enough institute to have the manpower to respond where we need human analysts intervening and also the technology to be observing, deconstructing, labeling, and doing base categorizations, deduplicating, and these sorts of things. So like finding the right combination of like a lot of the front-loaded work is being done by AI, and we have enough staff, librarians essentially serving society quickly, modeling up this content. We're just absolute elite experts, and them having all the tools that they need in order to quickly do that. So like journalists are reporting, and like, you know, stuff is happening on TV, we can be quickly incorporating that into like, you know, higher dimensions and more complex mapping, epistemic mapping of a situation. So I'm hoping one day, I don't know if it'll be in my lifetime, I'm probably underestimating technology, but I don't always imagine that it's in my lifetime, but I'm angling towards us having an instantaneous kind of institution for this, at least for publicly accessible knowledge.
I see Fabian has his hand up, but I just want to say thank you for something very specific. And that is surfing the line between being popularist and being arrogant or elitist, right? Because I do think it is really, really important to still value expertise, and our current culture isn't so happy with that. You know, I'm sure you have seen Hamilton. I'm sure you remember Aaron Burr. You know, I could have a beer with him, right? This is horrendous damage that is being dealt to us. So by you standing up for expertise without being arrogant, without taking a position, that's just fantastic. So thank you for that. And Fabian.
Yeah, so my question is, and maybe I missed it, but how do you interact with the result? Or how does somebody who wants to learn, let's say, get the expertise out of a topic, gets that? What I saw through the presentation, and again, maybe I misunderstood, but was unfolding the different part of the map. But is there another way to interact? I'm asking this specifically to see also again, how could this eventually be ported or considered for VR? Because a visualization, of course, is an object and you can see it, but you can do more with it. You can, for example, folding and unfolding. But once you got, again, for VR, the controllers or even your hand, you can manipulate it. Or if it's text, you can copy paste it, or you can. So there are very different and rich interactions. So yeah, I'm wondering what's the status of interactions right now, and what was the thinking process behind it? Because it doesn't necessarily, more interaction doesn't necessarily mean better. You want to constrain it to something productive. Right. So yeah, if you could dig a bit more there, I'd appreciate it.
Yep, there's a couple of different visualizations that we currently offer. It's essentially the same data, but we compress it and organize it differently. For some data, for some visualizations, we filter things out. So one thing that we do is we do make the map available. People can unclick and expand and do all of that. I don't think a lot of people are going to find that attractive. Some people are going to love it. Two is we're revealing something called Society Library Papers, where all of the data in that debate map is actually structured in a piece of paper where you can click on the lines and it opens up options to like further unfold not only the argumentation, but into the note itself. You can refresh so the different phrases and different ways of expressing things show up. You can press keys that will swiftly change it from technical to simple language. So you'll have your standard way it's expressed. It can flip between those, like show me the more technical, show me the more simple. It unpacks the argumentation. So papers is the new thing that we're rolling out. The other thing that we do is we create decision-making models. So we just zero in on one subsection of argumentation at a time, and people can add values to how they're weighting the different arguments, and they can essentially, we ask them to microvote, like what is the strongest argumentation in this one subset, and then they move on to the next set, and they move on to the next set, and at the end it's shown to them like, okay, well, where do you stand on these issues, economic, environmental, blah 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 blah. So the decision making models is the thing that we do at city council. And then the other thing we do is we just make all of the resources that we generated available in a text searchable library. So it's like you can look through all the references that have been included in this data set. You can keyword search and find the claims, not necessarily associated with each other. You can search it in the map as well, so it'll bring you to the part of the map where that claim is, and that claim can be in multiple places, so you can bounce around and see where all the places that this claim is, or you can just search it like in a library list. So those are the 4 things that we have in terms of visualizing content now. But I'm excited about thinking about doing the same kind of paper unpacking and unfolding, but with video. Let me see, what else do I have on my list? I may have been forgotten visualizations by now. but I think those four are the main ones, and hopefully there'll be more to come. Just looking at my list. Oh yeah. And then unless we do something specific like write legislation. We also have a designer who's working on a phone app version of it. But yeah, that's what we got. Oh, so in terms of like being able to interact. So for example, with the paper, like you can click on any line and it gives you the option to like expand it in various dimensions, show it to me in a video, show it to me in a podcast, where the references that support this, where the varying phrases, yada, yada. It would be so cool if in VR, and again, I don't know if this would actually translate well. It'd be cool if you could take a statement and actually open it up. Grab that statement, open it up. Oh, I can see all the videos, TV clips where this occurred, swipe to the left. Okay, here are the references. Okay, definitions. Okay, media artifacts. Okay, close that one up, star that one. I'll look at that later. Grab the next one. Let's open that up and take a look at what that looks like. Or like do a motion like this, and it just like spills out all the different claims that support it. Like I think there could be a lot of cool interactive ways that could make text a little less boring, simply because you're moving your body, and moving your body may create endorphins and make you a little bit more happy and excited about stuff. And that's what we're trying to do at paper. Is with paper, I didn't show you any interactivity at all. I just showed you like the mock-up. But like we're really focused on how it feels, like the sensation of unpacking. Frode's
thinking with movement, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's so important. But for paper, what we're really focused on is like how it feels. So like the slickness of the unpacking, the slight little sounds. Like we've been looking at the colors in when rendered to accommodate for different like visual, I don't want to say impairments, but different visual differences. And like it looks gorgeous and like all of them, in my opinion. So we've been like really focusing on the feel of it, because we know it's limited by text. But if we could translate that to VR, I think it could be much more interesting just by being able to literally work with knowledge, grab knowledge, put that over there, unpack, all that stuff.
A quick remark on this. I don't know if you're familiar with interactive explorations. Basically, it's the idea that you can have exercises in the middle of a piece. So you don't just like have a piece of text, but you have an exercise. And it's not just like a textbook-like exercise, but it's part of a story, so that you, in order to get the core idea of this article or concept or paper, you go through an exercise, and it's a guided interaction. Basically, you're not just like freely moving things around, but you're solving a small challenge, but that's going to get you to this eureka moment that the author of the paper had at some point, and that's why they were sharing this piece of information. And I think that also is something that could be valuable. Of course, freely manipulating, but a guided manipulation that makes the person who has to interact with gets the point of it, could also be quite interesting. And to here, I don't know how literal or metaphorical you want to be. Let's say you display a nuclear power plant, how close you are. You can zoom in and out to the atomic level or not. There are lots that can be done there, but yeah.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you if you saw my hand waving, because I got really excited.
That's good.
Because we did this, we did a mock-up once. We didn't get enough money for this project, but we actually did that for our COVID collection. So we built a 3D lab. We just did this in Prezi. So it was like very superficial, just a mock-up. We did it in Prezi because it has that zooming in and out feature. And we built the 3D lab where you could essentially zoom into the lungs of the lab worker who was there and explore all of the different argumentation about like respiratory health and what COVID does to the body. You could zoom into the microscope to learn about like argumentation about what SARS-CoV-2 as a virus is, like what are its features, what are the pictures that have been grabbed, like what kind of telescope, blah, blah, blah. So like we did that where we built a scene and people could zoom into different dimensions of it to explore different topics, like subtopics of debate within that. But we didn't get enough funding to like really do it for real. But I think that would be really fun.
The funding part, to be honest, is it's a bottleneck in the sense that it's super demanding to get this kind of materials, designing a 3D experience. But I think for those two cases, nuclear or let's say COVID, they are excellent for it because there are scales that are not graspable for most of us.
Yeah.
And I think for let's say if you're a technical expert, then it becomes natural because you did the exercise so many times that it does become natural. But being able to change scales in a way that is still that makes the intangible tangible is it's like a perfect use case for this.
Amazing. Oh, I'm excited to sit in on these meetings.
Peter, are you, is that an earlier hand or is that a fresh hand?
It's an ongoing hand that's been having things added to the queue
Okay.
as the chat's going on. Your description of waving your hands around reminds me a little bit of the user interface depicted in Minority Report. That was a very interesting movie to take a look at for the VR type visualization, well, more AR style visualizations in it. Also, the talk about instant votes and things reminded me of a wonderful episode of the Orville called Majority Rule, where everyone would walk around with smart badges that had an up arrow and a down arrow. And if you accumulated too many down arrow votes, you'd be lobotomized by the society.
Oh, no.
So it was just fascinating. Then substantively, have you taken a look at the foresight literature? There's a concept called a futures cone, and I put a link for that at 1223 in the chat. The basic idea is to represent multiple possible futures, and it seems like that could be a good visualization for providing an organizational access layer to the dialogue, because some of the different points would correspond to the same possible future, and that could provide a different view on the evolving debate structure. So for instance, there would be one possible future where the claims that the climate temperature is going to go out of control is correct. Then there's another possible future where it turns out that those studies might not necessarily have been accurate, more an artifact of modeling software. So you could take those possible futures and represent them in a visualization and use that as a filter onto the debate structure. Also, another very interesting diagramming technique is use of state machines, very popular in computer science and been touched on in linguistics and parsing to some extent. And the notion there is that you have a series of states with transitions between states. And you could associate different arguments with transitions between states where the states could represent possible futures in the futures cone kind of a visualization. Also, I would suggest having a look at the system dynamics literature, which has its own suite of visualizations, some of which are very nice web-based tools that look at feedback loops between different stocks and flows. And that again could provide a filter into the diagram structure, as some of the diagrams would relate to different elements in that visualization. So those are a couple of possible filtering access layers that you might want to have a look at. I have all the links in the side chat.
Thank you so much. I think I found everything that you posted in the side chat. I super appreciate that. It's getting some interaction interfacing with the forecasting community has been of interest, but I haven't had the capacity to explore how do they like what is the extent to which they model futures? Because I obviously would be interested in taking those projections and deconstructing it and seeing what it looks like in terms of translating it to society library language and concepts, so I can get a handle on it. But I haven't had the capacity to check that out. But thank you for these links because it's definitely on my list.
So, talking of links, first of all, as you know, this will be transcribed and put into the journal, both your presentation and this dialogue and the chat log. So if whoever's interested, go and have a look at our first two issues. Mark and I are still learning how to make it navigable because there's a lot in there. But then my question is actually quite different, and that is, a few years ago, I took an online quiz in a Norwegian newspaper on politics. And it asked me, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? Click through, very simple. At the end of it, it turned out that I should be voting for the Christian Democrats, which was a huge surprise because, you know, whatever. But so my question to you then is, have you considered letting your users model themselves in such a way so that when they go into this, they have a stated position that the system understands that is based on their answers?
I mean, when I think about those kind of quizzes, the first thing that pops into my mind is I really want to see the data that they're using to suggest that, because I want to know if their interpretation of this candidate's positions is the same as like the language I would use to describe my position interpreted by the language that they're giving me in maybe a multi-choice format to express it. So I've always like, I personally have trust issues with those particular things. So, I mean, there's so many different possibilities to create products from these data sets.
I'm thinking not necessarily about the quiz, because yes, that may just have been a journalistic gimmick. I'm thinking more about coming in and, let's say most of us here will probably say environment concern high. We state where we are on specific issues.
Yeah.
Healthcare should be shared or not. Just a few yes or no's, because that'll put you, because you talked about a kind of constellation earlier. There's also the spider graph, where you have lots of different dimensions and you can then see the shape of different people. And as long as people can be shown that dimension of themselves and say, this is who I believe I am, that may help their interaction somehow. I don't know if I'm going in a huge tangent or not.
It's not, one thing I think is interesting is that these types of quizzes, like whether it's Enneagram or Myers-Briggs or whatever, people love to like conceptualize themselves, I think. I think these things are popular because within a certain subset of people, they want to call themselves and identify themselves as something. So like being like, oh, I'm INTJ or I'm this or that. Like some people really love that stuff. So I think that could be a cool offering in terms of like, here is your graph of beliefs, like an astrological chart, like here's your sun sign and whatever sign. It's like, here's the dimensionality of your beliefs. I think that could be cool. But also you made me remember something, which is when we were talking earlier about like trying to combat cognitive biases. And I mentioned that, I believe it's a cognitive bias that people remember the first thing that they see, or people may have a backfire effect if they see something that immediately contradicts what they already believe. So people taking a quiz upon like being introduced to a new subject, like it would require for us to have like an account system, like they have to create an account so we can remember these preferences. I think it could be potentially a way to combat bias if we knew what people's strongly held beliefs are, so that those could be expressed first and then they can be confirmed as being understood. Because I think that's how you can overcome backfire, is you let people know, you model to them who they are. We hear you, we understand you, and here's the strongest version of the thing that you believe. Here's everything that you could possibly want. And now let's go explore everything else. So I think that would be useful, again, to start changing the way we interact with information to enable like enlightenment and open-mindedness for people who want to opt into something like that.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting what you're saying, because a cognitive bias is not a bad thing in and of itself. Same as a prejudice also is not a bad thing in and of itself. Without them, we can't function in the world. But, and of course, who you express you are depends on the circumstances where you are asked to show who you are. But I do think it is really, really an important issue because, for instance, our son, beautiful 4.5-year-old Edgar, he goes to a Catholic school, the name escapes me right now. What's the word, Mark? You'll think of it. But, we weren't sure about putting him in a religious system, but the reason we decided to do that was I'd much rather argue morals with him at home rather than him go to a school that doesn't allow that and then, try to teach him to be nice. Because a lot of these decisions come down to, how do you see your neighbors? How do you see yourself? How do you see the planet? All that stuff. Everything is filtered. You can't argue facts is something we keep being told again and again, right? So I'm just wondering, you have this incredible information landscape that is intelligently put together. If there was a mechanism of someone maybe even stating their beliefs, and then when they go into the system, finding out that they're not actually behaving within their stated beliefs, the typical thing being a right-wing Christian, there's no chance in hell Jesus was a right-wing Christian, right? As an example. To not only get the information in, but having a thing that is representing where it goes in over.
I think in the future, we're going to have a lot more capabilities to do things like that. And I hope so. Like I hope so, because knowledge and information is so powerful and impactful. And if we could just improve that relationship where like we kind of objectify knowledge and like kind of have like a new type of like etiquette around how we interact with it and allowing it to change us and open us and like it mirroring that it understands us and can again contrast us. I think that could be really, really wonderful. I think it's far out. for like the level of sophistication that you're talking about, and or I'm just failing to imagine. But I hope we get there, because I think that would just be so lovely. Because I personally love to think of humanity as like a species on an information diet. Like I think how we really survive is on information, all the different inputs that we have. So I think making that relationship even more sophisticated is hopefully in our future and for the best.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And sorry, as just a tiny little thing, and that's if you read Jaron Lanier's book on his VR experience journey, it's very little about the environment and very much about the self, how you change yourself in the environment. So to think about this in this context of being able to go into this information with an awareness of different ways you are yourself in this space. I know we're talking a huge down the line kind of thing, but it was just interesting to hear that. Right, Mark, I will shut up for a minute.
Okay, I'll very quickly, because I can see other hands are up. And just so I restrict myself to just one observation. Another thing I think the interesting that comes out of the really interesting deep landscape, data landscape you're making is the ability to sort of look at the, well, in almost the metadata. So when you look across the problem space, where are the references coming from?
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, there's a whole skein that goes over the top of this, which is not part of the argumentation or argument discovery per se. That's quite useful in a intelligence, very small I sense, in terms of understanding the, as it were, the problem environment space, I think. Anyway, I'll leave it there because I say that there are some people and some haven't spoken yet. So.
I will just say quickly, Mark, that
Yeah.
What you may love to hear is that like we do take great care to steelman things. So if we find arguments like on TV or in news, we will try to see like where is the rigorous academic literature on this. So it's not like just by luck that we're identifying and associating arguments with media types, because we always try to get the most rigorous as possible and the most accessible. So like if it exists in different media sets, we're really looking for them. And
yeah, it's just this interesting thing that sometimes now, you know, things you do seem certain sorts of argument seem to come from a or in a certain type. I don't want to typify it too much because then you get into the labeling, but it's just the sense that whereas you might think it'd be distributed across the piece, going through all channels or all age groups or whatever, it can be quite fragmented, and that's the kind of thing that the rich data that you're collecting also enables you to see, I think.
Yep, I agree. Okay, who would like to go next, Carl or Peter?
So, yeah, I posted a link on Peter Elbow had this article about the believing game, and it's I see a connection between that and the 6 thinking hats, in that there's so it's systematically seeking validity in what you don't agree with, kind of thing, and then it's interesting with dialogue mapping and Jeff Conklin's work, both Jeff and Edward De Bono, they focus so much on dialogue mapping and 6 thinking hats being a meeting facilitation process, but then there's also the whole individual sense-making process too. So the facilitation part is, so that's also like, I'm very big into dialogue and the facilitation process. So how do we get people engaging in real time and stuff too? So
yeah, and I think there's a lot.
Bring that to your attention.
Yeah, thank you. I copied those. I've never heard of the bleeding game or the 6 thinking hacks, actually. And I think that there's a lot that we could learn from bridging communities and facilitation communities, because what we're trying to do is kind of like technologically induce a space where people can interact with knowledge, maybe as if, and the different positions, maybe as if they were interacting with a person. We're not simulating that, but like, what are some things in terms of like the visualization itself that could kind of create that container that would make people feel like receptive and that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot that we can learn. I try to pick up things here and there from facilitation, mediation, and bridging to learn those things.
Just a quick thing. I mean, Conklin, I'm working with Jeff Conklin right now. He's yes, he's totally, his work really shows the value of facilitators in depersonalizing arguments and creating these synthesis, usually in real time. And I think it goes with what we were saying earlier about the importance of argumentation as a skill. And this was map making, like synthesis, map making, and consensus making as a skill. And yes, I agree totally. The question is how to weave individual sense making, which is, you know, more and more important activity, into creating these synthesis maps. And the question of creating synthesis from individual curated maps to collective curated maps is really the key articulation, but it's not going to be just crowdsourcing. It has to be learned. And there's many paths towards learning to do that. And it has to be a social learning about how to create these consensus maps.
Yeah, just one quick thing too, with the way they've separated out. So you have the issue mapping, which is gaining the competency with compendium and creating the maps. And then there's the dialogue mapping, which is the facilitation process. So I think that's really important for all these kind of tools.
And I personally believe, sorry, Jamie, we will need more than one map, and we will need to connect them. Like, for example, I think what Jamie is doing is a wonderful epistemic map. Like, why do people believe this? And someone was bringing these future maps. Well, when you do a future map, it's this may lead to that, may lead to that, may lead to that. It's a totally different temporal presentation. They shouldn't be on the same map, but you would want to know, why do you believe that this may lead to that, which is the epistemic dimension, connected to that, and vice versa, right? Why is the belief that this may lead to that also feeding into the epistemic questions? They're different representation. I don't think there's ever going to be one representation to them all, but we need to make presentation communicate.
Speaking of communication, one of the things that I was thinking too is that, like, I'm not a facilitator, so I have very limited knowledge of what that entails. But like, my understanding is, like, facilitation and mediation includes deploying all sorts of different communication techniques to, like, position people, like, in the space where they can then, like, proceed with a conversation and interact with something that is potentially conflictual. So I've been thinking too is, like, how could we, like, maybe there could be in thinking of how do we borrow from facilitation to enable interaction with our content in a successful way. Like, maybe there'd be a chatbot feature where we train it on different facilitation communication strategies. So someone's interacting with knowledge and someone's getting off track, they know how to, like, oh, hey, okay, like, let me reframe what you just said and let's move it now over back to the map. So there'd be a relationship between a chat bot that could kind of carry on the conversational AI element to, like, walk people through the epistemic map, because it may be too dry to ask someone to go back and forth, pro and con, down from position to more precise argumentation. Like, that may be too much, besides readers who are just generally interested in exploring a deliberation. But in deploying it to a chat bot and integrating it with that, I think is something that could be in the future as well. And if someone isn't already working on, like, capturing all of the facilitation, like, techniques, I hope they do. And they train an AI to, like, be able to have the conversations. That would be really cool.
Yeah, you're talking about something being too cold. I think that's a very good question here. You know, you're building an incredible intellectual tool, and of course, emotions will come into it at some point. So your enthusiasm for VR, and I think you understand VR like we do, just multidimensional, doesn't matter if it's a headset or whatever particulars, will definitely come in to make people feel more embodied and more involved and more aware. One of the great things about this book I keep holding up is it points out that if you want to be more rational, you listen to your body more than your head. Your head is more emotional than your body, which was a bit of a surprise. So maybe we can help people gather those understandings. I'm not sure why Brandel is not here. He's always available. He's very involved, so there must be a good reason. So when he watches this video of it at some point, we miss you, Brandel. Hope to see you together with the group soon. We have 7 more minutes, and Peter will have one of the final questions.
All right. I was wondering whether you're doing anything to flag bias of the sources that are behind the sources that are being referenced in the articles. A very common phenomena is that you'll have some group with a name like Concerned Parents Trying to Improve Safety in Schools and yada, yada, yada. And then you look at it and you find out that it's really a front group for gun manufacturers. Or you'll have a piece of legislation and the name of the legislation is the exact inverse of what the functional result of the legislation would be. Also, I was wondering whether you're looking at pop culture as sources of argumentation too. There's a wonderful wiki called TV Tropes that has links to just about every single movie, book, manga piece of resource out there. Plus, they also cross-link to examples of those tropes in real life. So
I love it.
you can find whole sections on every TV show that discuss climate change in there. And sometimes you'll actually have people use the fictional medium to express policy disputes because they're afraid that if they put it out on Twitter, they might get canceled from Twitter. But you can have an alien of some crazy race make the argument in a science fiction story, and you can discuss those social and policy issues that you couldn't otherwise. Orville is a great source of those sorts of stories.
So first of all, I just want to say, Peter, oh my God, thank you so much. I'm so excited for TV Tropes. Thank you. We deconstruct like film, but not like, you know, television shows and like non-documentary film. So this actually just may be a whole other source of media that we may really dive into, because I mean, we do archive memes and we make memes available. So like when you said pop culture, I was like, oh yeah, we do like the graphic image memes, like for sure. But I didn't think about like, yeah, an alien on like a sci-fi film making a critique about something. Didn't think of that. Thank you very much, Peter. And then as for your other question, yes, but we have to be careful with labeling, because labeling is very much a matter of fact, and we don't want to make a mistake and be incorrect about matters of fact. So like when we label something opinion or needs to be fact checked or no evidence provided, or this is cherry picking or something like that, it's because it very easily is associated with matters of fact. Like there's a definition for a thing that's commonly accepted. This meets that definition, therefore it is. But when it comes to like astroturfing and predatory journals and things like that, it's more of a matter of argumentation. And so we actually do model that in argumentation. So for example, there's this whole set of content from this one person who has published only in predatory journals, and we had to like deconstruct the website and like essentially build out all the argumentation about how the data is not verifiable, the journal in which it was published, it is not credible in these ways, but we had to model that as argumentation. And what we have to do in terms of our responsibility is just, we have to make sure when it's visualized, they pop up at the same time. So it's not buried, all of the counter argumentation that suggests this is invalid. It's, hey, like because of the severity and weight, the argumentations against this other data, you need to see these things at the same time. So yeah, we do that. We do our due diligence and look on those like lists of like suggested predatory journals. And then we check out the website. Did the websites essentially say it's pay to publish? Do they have no peer review? Do they have no editorial board? Like essentially pick it apart and then make sure that that metadata expressed through argumentation, essentially saying like this is invalid or, you know, blah, blah,
Right,
blah.
and also can be subtle. For this person might have a gorgeous new office in the Pfizer wing of his school and be publishing strong arguments in favor of Pfizer's latest designer drug. And then you'd wonder, well, if he did a study that was designed to be able to find problems with that drug, would his school still have the funding to build that building? Or would he suddenly find that the primary source of his salary has gone away? And that might be influencing the way he structures his science. There's also a community, I think it's called T, that's looking at reproducibility in science, that you might want to have a look at if you aren't already familiar with their work.
There's a whole bunch of people working on the reproducibility issue, but what are they called?
T, I think is their acronym.
Okay, TEA?
Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, great.
Since
Well,
we
searching for that and reproducibility should pull them up.
Cool, thank you. Thanks, Peter.
started
Yeah,
a
my
bit late,
pleasure.
we'll do a few more minutes. And actually, Fabian, you go first.
Just to bounce back on Peter Mark, I also posted on the chat a book on agnotology and the study of political ignorance. I really warmly recommend it. I say warmly, even though it's a horrible thing, but I think it is important. So it's very exciting to hear the process you're going through, and that prompted me to wonder. So what I did at some point, I gathered most of the links of the articles, but even random pages I read, and I put them on my wiki. And what I did, it was the opposite, meaning that I have a plugin from the browser that say, oh, you've already read that page, and that page is on that topic. So I can browse back my own notes based on what I'm seeing on my browser, on my screen right now. And I'm wondering if that could also be a way, again, because it sounds like your process is very thorough and could be practical behind quote unquote just the map itself, but let's say on a during normal browsing session, being able to connect back to the map, for example. So I'm wondering if you've done that, or if you believe that could be useful to browse the web, and then as you go through a document, a piece of information that you already analyzed and is already referenced, if we could link back and browse the map at a certain point.
Short answer, yes. Long answer, I'll have to get back to because there's a knock at my door. So I'm just going to excuse myself for just 1 second to go check on that. One moment.
That's a great teaser. I'll do a bit of promotion for the book I put in the chat in the meantime. If you're wondering about the tobacco industry and what was it, the alcohol, I think, industry too, different, how do you say, sales of Nobel Prizes on topics that we're not necessarily familiar with yet. Thank you, they're all industry too. And that you see the same heads, that's a great book. That's an extremely sad one, but you see the history of convincing people that don't necessarily have the expertise, but still have the intellectual prestige. So yeah, very valuable.
I found the reproducibility link. I dropped it in the chat.
Yay, thank you. Okay, so yeah, short answer, yes, we've been thinking about that, Fabian. One of the new tools that we want to build actually is going to be a web annotation system so that people can go all the way through like the chain of us collecting content, extracting it. So instead of, you saw the spreadsheets where we copy things over to text and then deconstruct from there. That's really lovely because if linked to those things, people can see the exact line, but it would be lovely if it was just native. Like they can go to the archive.org website and see like we've highlighted this and here it is. And then having that as a plugin that other people can like go and traverse and just like opt in to see, has the Society Library pulled this out and seen this somewhere and like implemented this somewhere, is definitely like in the timeline of things that we want to incorporate for sure. Not possible yet, but yes, we've been thinking about it. Because then, and here's the other thing too, I don't have a huge amount of hope for like integrating with Twitter and Facebook and things like that, because I know a lot of friends of mine who created great products have not been able to like get through the door. But that could be a thing too also, is like, let's say if there was a way of detecting like the semantic similarity of a tweet with a Society Library snippet. They do this with Wikipedia on YouTube, for example. There's a particular topic, they'll be like, here's the Wikipedia page on it, in like a bar underneath to try and like promote people like going to a source that YouTube finds to be substantial in order to look research into that more. And then it could also be such that journalists could reference our databases and essentially like cite it in their news articles, and people could link out to go see the library. So it's like in the creation of new content, it connects to the library, and then the library could also backtrack to, this is where we derive the claims that populate this library in other media content as well. And that's just like web annotation and plugins and things like that.
So final for me anyway is the work that I'm doing with my basic software, author and reader. It's bizarre. It took me 2 hours to see how it kind of connected with this. I think it's probably because what I'm doing is so insanely much simpler than this. But the reason I want to highlight it to ask you a question is in author, which is very much targeted at students. Part of the writing is for them to define things. If it's important for them, write what it is. So you would write something like Doug Engelbart and then a definition. In my case, I would write Doug Engelbart was my friend, blah, blah, blah. So it's personal. It's not pretending to be objective truth. And then maybe I'll mention SRI. If I then somewhere else write SRI, when I then go back to the map and I move anything I want, click on Doug, there will be a line to SRI purely because the text mentions it. Nothing more fancy. Right? But the reason I'm highlighting it to you, because you have this incredibly rich environment, is simply that it seems that if you make people define things, it helps their own thinking. And if they can then see how they connect. So I'm wondering if you can have a layer within the work you have. There were maybe, I'm throwing like $10 million research project at you here. So I'm not realistically saying do it now, but you go through this knowledge environment, you pick things up. And you say, well, I think this is bullshit, or I think this is important, or I think this relates to it, whatever it might be, but in a separate space, so that after a while, when they keep doing this, they get a better insight to their heads. And I can see Mark and Antoine making all kinds of head movements because I know it's related to his work. But I'm wondering if you both have a brief comment, and then we need to wind up.
Okay, well, I'll just say one thing is that what you expressed reminds me of some exercises we do at the Society Library when we teach students about having them extricate, what is meant in claims. It's not the same thing in terms of defining things, but like it is an exercise. And I will just say that the feedback we get from students from performing logical deconstruction exercises, pulling out all the claims in media, is that we've heard many, many times that it's like by the end of the semester, they gain a new sight because they just inherently see the density of language in a way that they didn't see it before. And like, it's really lovely because so many of them get so excited and they come back and volunteer for us. Like they're really enthusiastic about what they've learned and they find it to be very valuable. So I think that an exercise like that could also be very valuable just based on the feedback we get from our exercises, which are not the same, but similar. And then what you expressed reminded me of is that like I just had the thought just now of like a new kind of exercise where students could be compelled to be presented an argument and then counter argue with it. And then they can see like how the society librarians actually steelman that argument. So they could work through the database, only seeing partial pieces and are like doing their own research and counter arguing and then comparing that against like the professional version. And maybe it's better, maybe it's not better. And that could help refine their thinking as well. So yeah, I think that's those types of exercises really do help people with critical thinking, and I think at just increasing their epistemic literacy as well, of like just really knowing like how many assumptions that we pack in to our everyday expressions and understanding, and when we're like forced to extricate that by defining or deconstructing, like we really start to appreciate like the density and complexity of meaning in knowledge.
Fantastic. I mean, tools for thought is part of this big thing. Mark-Juan, was that your hand or was that a little mouse?
That was me. Sorry, I'm going to diverge a bit, and this is my thinking, not the Society Library, but the question of definitions, as you put it, is fundamental. And what you're doing, Frode, is encouraging people to do their local contextual definition. And Jamie's tool and work certainly does contribute to identifying specific definitions and work, and what I'm currently most interested in is how to assemble social definitions from individual definitions, and how to identify how they relate, where are the differences, because and including in emerging concept conversations. Like in some conversations, the concepts are emerging, the definitions are being negotiated, are being and evolving and renegotiated. And this is where the ability to tag not tag because I don't believe in tags, but show the relationship between the concepts is extremely important. And when I say show the relationship, and that's another thing I wanted to say to you, I think that the ability to qualify links is primordial. Bruno Latour, who's a historian of science, has said that erasing the nature of links is one of the great crimes of 21st century thinking. Saying these things are related. How? Doesn't matter. That is absolutely terrible. The understanding how things are related is really key to a certain precision of thinking.
Yes.
And having a good epistemology and ontology of how things are related, I think, is absolutely fundamental. And how things change when you push them from one domain to another. That's Latour's work. But I think that and being able to show how things change, exactly what I meant. When you shift from one definition to another is when there's these shifts of meaning which are necessary. They're not always bad. Some of it is confusion, some of it is the ability, fluidity, but you need to be able to identify it.
Yep.
And that means naming the relationship.
Yep. I just want to quickly say, because this may be relevant to everyone else, the conversation of definitions has come up in communities that Marc-Antoine and I have both been in. And you may all find this to be very interesting, that the Society Library approach to definitions is also descriptive. So for example, like when we actually create definitions, when we create definitions, we can disambiguate them for the situation, which is really important in the data architecture. But also, like, we only give definitions to things that aren't heavily contested. So the definition of climate change, for example, in the Society Library database, there's 19 different definitions. And that's because it's such a common phrase that's actually just like a zip file of like 19 different files. It's the same like name for like 19 different zip files of meaning of what people imply when they're using the term. So when it comes to modeling argumentation, you can't just say, okay, climate change, you know, like, because so many people are just going to come to that and interpret different meanings. So we've had to like find different, like climate crisis is a little bit different than catastrophic climate change, is a little bit different than global warming, like all these different things. And then we're just gonna have to get to the point where we just start like creating new names, like the climate change hoax, all these different like small differentiations so that people know like we're not talking about climate change in the same way at all. So for us, that is actually a debate. Our primary question within the climate change database is, what does change? And there's like 19 different arguments about what climate change actually means and entails, and there's evidence to support that. It's derived from different media sets, et cetera. But many of the definitions that are not contested, like what is the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant? Oh, it's like a double loop Westinghouse, blah, blah, blah. That's not really something people argue about. So we just like give it its definition.
And on that bombshell, thank you very much, Jamie, and everyone else. And, you know, we're here every Monday and Friday. I look forward to having this transcribed. Will take a while. Organizing it, cleaning it up, and continue the dialogue and making amazing things happen. In this community, we're looking forward to doing some sort of a flatland, which is what we call what we're on now, into VR environments and back again demonstration of the future of text at the end of the year. So it's very interesting to have the insights, knowledge, and questions from today, and hopefully some degree of dialogue collaboration. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Thank you all so much for your time. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for the talk. We really enjoyed it.
Hey, everybody.
Bye.
It's great.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks,
Bye.
Jamie.
Thanks.